Good afternoon, almost good evening now, and welcome to this Rural R&D Forum and showcase of the best of some of the stuff that we do here in Australia. And it's great to have your company tonight. We've got some real movers and shakers from rural research and development in the Australian sector here tonight with us, and you'll have a great opportunity to mix with them later on in the evening. First though, for those who may not know me, I'm Lee Radford. I'm the head of rural and national programs for the ABC's regional division, and I'm also Australia's current representative to the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists, which is a great thing to be doing too, and part of the reason why I'm here with all of these international journalists, and I'll tell you more about them in just a moment. But first, on behalf of the Council of Rural Research and Development Corporations, the Australian Council of Agricultural Journalists and guests, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we gather here today and pay my respects to their elders past and present and to emerging community leaders. We also acknowledge the important role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within the agricultural industry and the communities we work with. And where we are at the moment, ladies and gentlemen, we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. This is a special event tonight. It's actually being webcast as well, so it's not just those of us who are in the room who are benefiting from the conversation this evening. It's actually going out far beyond here, and who knows who could be listening or watching to what's going on. Tonight's all about showcasing rural research and development in Australia and showcasing this to a visiting group of agricultural journalists and communicators from a range of countries. We've got Twitter happening tonight as well. We are hoping to engage with a broader community beyond this room. We've been tweeting this afternoon with the hashtag 21centuryag, all one word. That's hashtag 21centuryag. And we're hoping to get questions from people beyond this room and within this room as we go on this evening. So to set the scene for those who haven't been in far north Queensland in the last couple of days, these journalists have been since last Thursday afternoon. They've been looking at tropical agriculture firsthand and in some cases for the very first time. They've witnessed some operations on a truly large scale, and they've already seen some of the innovation and best practice that's happening on farms in far north Queensland. And they've also seen what happens on the land has an absolute connection and relevance for the health of one of the world's 7 great natural wonders, of course, the Great Barrier Reef. Tomorrow, these agricultural journalists are off to New Zealand for the World Congress of the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists. But tonight, they're keen to see where Australian industry is heading, how researchers are connecting with producers and the broader community, and then looking at the changing consumer demands and expectations in this country and beyond. Australian rural industries and agribusiness are one of the 5 pillars of the Australian economy, with the production sector generating $55 billion annually and providing a foundation for about 12% of Australia's economy. But more importantly, these successful, vibrant industries are responsible for producing the food that we eat. There are many reasons why consumers can be encouraged and be comfortable with buying Australian food and fibre products. Through innovation, we're driving more value for producers, consumers and the broader community, while competing against countries with lower costs and less variability. So the future, ladies and gentlemen, is coming. So how much can we see of the path ahead? Well, tonight we're joined by a fantastic panel who have agreed to be here tonight to talk about what's happening in Australia and to answer your questions too as they arise. And I'd encourage you to put up your hand. We have roving microphones, and if at any stage you'd like to become part of the conversation and ask questions of any of our panellists, that'd be terrific. I'm going to go over there and join them in a minute and sit on one of the stalls. But first and foremost, what I'd like to do is to go through our panel of experts tonight and actually have them introduce themselves in their own words and tell you just a little bit about who they are. We're going to start off with Mick Keogh. Mick is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Farm Institute. He's been a farmer, he's an academic, and he's a bit of a policy guru, and one of those guys at things like this you just have to have. Mick, tell us a little more.
Thanks, Lee. Yes, growing up on a farm and then heading off to university because I could count that 7 siblings divided by the number of acres meant find something else to do. Various different roles then as a university researcher with an advocacy organisation for farmers at the New South Wales level, and then ultimately in my current role as the Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute, which is we hate to use the term, but it's referred to as a think tank focusing specifically on agricultural policy issues. So we conduct research predominantly around specific issues, trying to be a bit strategic, trying to look to the future, trying to identify some of the issues that will impact on the agriculture sector in Australia and identify the ways in which they can be better managed to the benefit of agriculture. So we have a large range of corporate members from the banking sector, from the agrochemical sector, and right across the board, and they all contribute to the work we do. So we're a non-government organisation funded largely by the private sector with a focus on agricultural policy issues that are relevant to Australia.
Thank you, Mick. And our next panellist tonight is actually a farmer. Edwina Beveridge is a pork producer here in New South Wales at Blantyre Farms, and she's also a member of the New South Wales Primary Industries Advisory Council. Tell us a little bit more, Edwina.
Okay, well, a little out of place looking at the Opera House rather than at pig sheds, but I'm a pig farmer from Young in New South Wales. My husband and I have a 2,200 sow pig farm, which means we turn off about 900 pigs every week. A few of the things we're really proud of on our farm, firstly, 50% of the feed that we feed our pigs comes from other people's byproducts. So a lot of things from human food factories that are not fit for human consumption, we then feed our pigs. And that's really a great thing for us because it keeps the cost of our feed down, limits the effect of grain prices going up for us, and it's something that not many other people in the country do. We also have a methane digestion system where we capture the methane gas from our pig manure and turn it into electricity, which then powers all of our own site, and we also sell the excess electricity back to the grid. And part of that system also from the generator, there's a heat exchanger which heats hot water, and then we use that hot water to heat up our little baby pigs. And it really is a free heater. So it's taken us a while to get used to being okay with leaving the windows open and the heaters on. And that's about it for the moment. Oh, another little thing, we've just bought a robotic pressure washer about a couple of weeks ago. That's our latest innovation we're trying. The jury's out whether it works or not, but we'll see. We're hoping it'll save us a little bit of labour and also stop people having to do a job that's pretty ordinary.
What's this, washing the pigs or washing the stalls?
No, washing the sheds where every time we wean pigs and put little pigs back in, we have to wash it and disinfect it. And so someone pressure washes it. On our farm, someone, 24 hours a day, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, someone is pressure washing usually. And so we're hoping this robotic pressure washer will just reduce the amount of hours that someone does that. And it's a pretty crappy job. If I asked you to do it, Lee, you wouldn't last a week, I promise.
Well, welcome to you, Edwina. It's great to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
Our next panellist tonight is Dr. Ben McNeil. He's the founder and CEO of Thinkable.org. Tell us a little bit about you, Ben, and Thinkable.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks a lot, everyone, for having me. I don't have any distinguished ag sort of specialties like you guys. My background's in research, pure research. I'm from the Gold Coast originally, so I did a lot of surfing actually, not sort of on the coast. But I'm at UNSW, University of New South Wales. I've had a sort of deep experience in both US research as well as Australian research. In the last couple of years, I've founded and built essentially it's an online R&D platform. So instead of the traditional way of research happening, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, behind closed doors and no one understands what's happening because it's all PDF and jargon, we essentially create a very open online platform for any technology or innovation to be presented to individuals and companies. And companies or businesses can actually partner with us to source amazing projects around the world or around Australia. I'll probably leave it there, but that's pretty much what I do. I'll talk a little bit about later with the presentation, but it's really about inspiring innovation and driving innovation the best way possible through an online means.
Thank you very much, Ben, and welcome to you tonight. Now, to an international flavour to our panel now, and that is Marcus Rediger, who is the president of the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists, which is a full-time job in itself, I reckon, but that's only his part-time job because normally he's the editor and managing director of the Agricultural Information Centre in Switzerland, in Bern. Marcus, welcome to you. Tell us a little bit more about what you get up to.
Thank you, Lee. I have, as you said, I wear here two hats. One as the head of IFHA as a journalist, and the other representing LID, the Agricultural Information Centre. I grew up on a farm in Basel, Switzerland, and my brothers are still farming there. And this is also, when it comes to R&D, the hometown of Syngenta and Novartis, which are quite strong in innovation and development. As a journalist, I look at innovation and at development. I think for me it's very important to find the good stories, whether we tell it to the farmers or we tell it to the consumers, to the general public. So we are always looking out, what's going on in the sector and communicate about it. And I think it's not only for the farmers or for our readers important to get to know what's going on, but it's also inspiring for the whole sectors when the journalists are doing a good job. And I think this is not only a national, but it's a global business. That's what we experienced here while we were touring Queensland and Australia.
And welcome to you, Marcus. And I should add too that Marcus has just done a whiplash tour of Australia, folks. He has been literally from one side of the country in no time flat, mixing with all the rural press clubs around the country as well. So thank you for your time and coming out extra early before the pre-Congress tour to do that, Marcus.
Oh, well, thank you and your colleagues very much for arranging this. It was a very inspiring experience that I had in the many parts of your country. It's a great country and it's interesting agriculture. Thank you.
We're delighted to have you here. And Georgia Toomey is a commodity analyst with Rabobank. Georgia, tell us a little bit more about what you do with Rabobank.
Thank you. And yes, so I work as one of 80 global analysts looking at the food and agri-research sector. Rabobank is one of the leading global food and ag banks with the sole focus on that sector. So research plays a critical role in, I guess, supporting the business itself and understanding where the future lies, but also in supporting our clients and adding value to their enterprise as well. My background, I probably didn't get so inspired by agriculture from my farming background, in that I think Dad always chose the worst possible day of the year to do fencing or drafting sheep or something, so we had rain going sideways and wind coming across. But it was more actually coming to university in Sydney and looking for products that exemplified what we grew and how we grew it on the farm. And there was very limited availability of wool at the time, which I found quite frustrating. And therein lied my passion to kind of pursue agriculture and understand a little bit more about the complexity of the supply chain, which no doubt provides a lot of challenge, but a lot of opportunity as well.
Fantastic, and welcome to you, Georgia. Terrific to have you here as part of the panel tonight. So we've now met the panel, everyone. What we're going to do now is go through 3 separate presentations that will set the scene with different issues. And the first of those tonight is looking at opportunities and challenges for the Australian industry from new technologies. This particular presentation is being done by Robert Fitch. I'm sorry, Robert. I was looking for your name and I couldn't see it quickly there within my notes. Robert is from the University of Sydney. And this guy is one seriously cool individual. He's into robotics and they are into some awesome stuff. Tell us all about it.
Great, thanks Lee, and thanks to you all. Let's talk about robots. So it's new science, but based on some actually very old principles. So as early as 1858, people were thinking about things like putting tracks on paddocks and putting little machines like this that are modular. They do various different things, but they were limited by the technology at the time, steam engines and so forth. But now, my clicker wants to work. Maybe you could give me a little click. Okay. Now we have robots. So these are all Australian, and they're doing some very useful things. So one of the things they're doing is working in ports. This is a project that we did about 15 years ago, and they're moving shipping containers around, and there's many of them. This is in Brisbane, but it's also being implemented in Sydney. So we also have robots working in mining. So this is one of many machines that we've worked with in terms of mining. This is a drill rig, and not only does it drive itself, it also drills by itself, and it has sensors on the drill bit that tell it a little bit about understanding what it's actually drilling through. So we also have robots working in defense, and this is one of the projects. So this is a sniper training system. It works a little bit better than the tracks moving, little targets moving on tracks. And this is an example of something that we're actually exporting to the US. So what we want to do now is think about how we can take all this experience and all this expertise and apply it to agriculture. This is one of the first projects that we worked with. This is with QUT and a private wheat farmer in Queensland named Andrew Bate. So that was day one of prototype one, but it's come a long way since. So here's prototype 2. So Andrew's actually taken this and started a company, a startup company, to do robotics in agriculture. The idea is that you have many small machines like this that work together as a team to cover these very large areas. And so this is the sort of third prototype, and this is now going to be commercial. And what's important to note about this is that this is built by a farmer. And that's very exciting for someone like me who's a scientist and who loves to see work leaving the lab and entering the real world. So here's another project. So this is with Horticulture Innovation Australia. And this is in tree crop horticulture. So these are almonds. And this robot has a laser, not like a Star Wars laser, but a laser that tells us about the geometry of these trees. And then we can take the images associated with each tree and build a kind of map. And this is for things like yield estimation. But we can do more with those images. We can do things like counting. So we can count flowers or blossoms in this case, but also apples, again for yield estimation. And not just that, but mangoes, lychees, what have you. So these are general algorithms. And we can also think about using this for weeds. So this is a project with Ozveg, and this is called the Ladybird robot, and this is for vegetable crops. I'll show you this in action. It doesn't quite move that fast. But you can see the kind of data that we could collect. So this is from a stereo camera, so you can sort of understand what it's doing. But there's many other sensors underneath this as well. And what we're talking about is an unprecedented level of information. Okay, precise, timely, and in a way that just wasn't available before. So once you could do something like this, you could think about putting a robot arm underneath it, and you could bolt on anything you like: RIT blasting, microwaves, and even little steerable nozzles that can target individual weeds. And so this is in our lab, but we've also done this in the field, and I'll show you the latest incarnation. And so we call this the Ripper. And this has a high-speed steerable nozzle that can do 20 to 30 weeds per second, and also has some nice mobility. So for fun, I'm going to show you some cows, because people said, well, you can't actually use a robot to herd cows, but, well, we did it anyway, and that's a lot of fun. Okay, so I'm going to... Okay, so we'll wrap up here. So I guess the takeaway message here is to not just focus on the robot, but to think beyond the robot. Okay, so it's the robot plus operations plus plants that really allows us to get at those long-standing principles that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So time's up. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for those insights. It's fascinating stuff, and I've got to tell you, for our international guests, that the University of Sydney is doing some remarkable stuff with robotics, and it's very, very exciting to see. We've reported on it quite a lot recently. Now, Edwina, you volunteered that you're pretty enthusiastic about robots right off the cuff. What do you think about the future of robotics as applied to agriculture, helping to drive innovation?
I'm looking forward to there being pigs in the next presentation. I think there's lots of opportunities. There's lots, particularly in pig farming, there's lots of repetitive tasks, so there's lots of things that could be done. We also have sheep and cattle and grow crops, and there's lots of things that can be done, particularly with the cropping.
Now, as I said earlier, we have roving microphones. If you'd like to ask any of these guys a question at any stage, please feel very free to do so. You're not interrupting, you're part of the conversation. Or, if you're a little bit shy, you can tweet it, and Carolyn or one of the others will hand me a piece of paper with your question from your tweet. So please don't be shy. Mick, what do you think about robotics driving innovation in agriculture?
I think there's some fascinating developments occurring. Intensive agriculture, so in other words, the horticulture or intensive livestock lends themselves a bit more immediately. But when we look at, for example, the Corn Belt in the US and see the degree of digitisation that's occurred and the technology that's now being applied to manage that digital information and close the loop with variable rate applications, yield maps, all that sort of stuff, I think that's the next era for broadacre agriculture here, to get to a stage where you've got an integrated digital information platform, you've got multiple sensors providing you with objective information, and you're managing at the individual animal or the square metre level, not the flock or the paddock level. I think there's productivity gains. If we go on the Corn Belt in the US, there's 10 to 15% productivity gain in moving from paddock or field average to square metre and individual animal rather than flock or herd. And I think that's the real excitement. Now, robotics may be part of that in terms of some of the auto steering and some of those sorts of things for broadacre, but probably more so for, I think, the intensive and the horticulture sector to start with.
Do you think it could be a game changer for labour costs? Because I think some of our international guests are quite surprised at the cost of labour here in the sector in Australia compared to other parts of the world and the competitive advantage that they have because of that.
Yeah, and that's my observation, and I know it fairly close to home. My university student's son was picking up $240 for a day's work yesterday, dragging large crossbred ewes across the board for some shearers down at Wagga. So, you know, the labour costs here are in the region of $25 an hour for that sort of pretty basic unskilled labour, which has really driven, if you look at agriculture in Australia, it's probably shed around about 25% of its labour force over the last 5 years. And that's part of the reason that it's really pushing, those labour costs have really pushed agriculture in Australia, particularly broadacre agriculture, but also the intensives, to find any possible way to remove labour. And if we can digitise the information, if we can automate a lot of the processes, then that's the real driver that's occurring at the moment.
Marcus, what about in Europe? Is there a push towards robotics and this kind of innovation in European agriculture?
I think there is a huge openness towards this technology. It may be different from country to country, as from the point of view of Switzerland, we know with robotics we also have some research that is done, and with drones, and I think it's there, and if it's there, we always have a percentage of farmers that will pick it up very soon. We will have the agri-media will report about it, and then I think this pushes the pickup of this technology. And I think in Switzerland, it's not that much that we would produce more, but more efficiently. And if I look at your labor cost, from my point of view, it's not expensive, because labor costs are in Europe and in Switzerland are also very high. So we are also interested that that technology would replace labor. Also, we need workplaces, but this is the trend that is going in agriculture. My question that I would have to you is, when I was in Perth, I was talking at the agricultural show. That was Andrew Williams told me, who was responsible for the cow sheds there. They had 23 different breeds of cows there and beef. And he told me that in the dry areas they would like to change, to the more drought resistant breeds like Brahman and so on. And he said farmers are too slow to pick it up because they're used to what they did so far. So if we have innovation and new ideas and new solutions and nobody picks them up, what are we going to do?
Ben, what are your thoughts about driving innovation and developing agriculture in this country? Obviously, robotics is one thing. What about more broadly?
I think even just the robotics, I mean, how amazing was that technology? I would have actually a poll. Who has heard of this type of technology generally for ag? So, how many? So 60%? I don't know, 80%? I don't know what the number is. So, that specific technology from Uni of Sydney? Yeah. How many? So not as many. So I guess think about, I would say from a local perspective, that's a sort of 50% uptake from, let's say, the University of Sydney. But think about China and everywhere else around the world trying to work out if they want to actually purchase and take that R&D, that innovation, and do it globally, right? So I think this is a really important point. I'm not talking from the producer side. I'm talking more from the export side. So technology, just because we're a small producer, let's say, well, I saw that stat before, about 2% in terms of global commodity, or let's say in ag, that really gives us an opportunity, and New Zealand, by the way, Australia and New Zealand, to take technologies, invest a little bit of risk capital in that R&D and then innovation, and then take it globally, right? So because we have this wonderful advanced ag supply, it's like an incubator. So Australian farms can be essentially little incubators for these types of innovations, to partner with researchers and then take them globally. So I see that as a really big, from my perspective, really big opportunity that we could have in Australia and New Zealand if we connect with those wonderful ideas. And we have wonderful ideas across the spectrum, from water to food to whatever it may be. And so I think that's the opportunity.
How do you connect those dots?
Well, that's where the internet does have a power, right? So you can democratise ideas. So anyone can have access to those ideas, but it has to be in a way which makes sense given the time constraints of farmers and given the time constraints of investors and given the time constraints of everyone. Has to be in a way which is understandable and also somewhere where you can connect and track the research as well. So I guess there are challenges in that regard, but online provides sort of this opportunity to do that. That's why it's so exciting.
It is very exciting going forward. Georgia, Rabobank has a real reputation for being in touch with its customers around Australia on the land. Do you sit around talking about new innovations in technology and that driving innovation? Is that something that as an organisation, as a bank, that you have a healthy interest in as well?
Oh, absolutely, and that's largely because the investment and the discussion around the investment that we have with clients is about, well, what kind of benefits is that going to bring to their business and what kind of gains. We recently had a case study with a farmer based in the south of the South Island in New Zealand who had adopted a drone about 18 months ago, and the kind of gains that he'd made, so it was about a $15,000 investment at the time. In the first year, he felt that he had about $35,000 worth of gains, both in labour savings and costs and in fewer losses of stock. And that's purely on a sheep farm, whereby they would use the drone, and instead of opening, I think it was around 300 gates to the furthest paddock in the farm, to use the drone to check the sheep, to use that management. And I think that those kind of immediate gains, he's identified a number of applications that the technology could be useful for within their business, and certainly the benefits sort of extrapolate as time goes on. So the potential for measuring dry matter and feed and turning lambs off at the right time is all an incredible opportunity. So we definitely have those conversations and understand what their business plan is and how we can be involved in the adoption of that technology. I think the other critical factor, particularly in this case, was that it was driven and operated by his 14-year-old son, which provided a link for his son and his family into his business and how they operated in an area that they were genuinely excited to be involved in. He now, I think, uses the drone and freelances for neighbours and operates it for them because he's excited about what that technology brings and what it means, and I guess he's excited about the future of it.
And certainly it's a force for good. We're talking about the exciting things here, about the capacity to drive innovation. But there are some less than, I suppose, constructive uses of technology at times. Edwina, I don't know how much you would be prepared to talk about it, but certainly you've been on the receiving end of other people using technology to cause you a whole world of pain.
Indeed. Fortunately, our pigs are all in sheds, so drones aren't such an issue for us, but we did find hidden cameras inside the ceilings of some of our pig sheds, and an animal activist group has filmed us for 1 month going about our business in our sheds, and we later discovered that they'd been in and out of our farm 8 times that we know of. So they used good technology to do that. That might also be their undoing. I'm hoping that will help the police in working out who did it.
How much grief did that cause you? Apart from the fact that I imagine you felt some sense of violation from people illegally entering your property and putting you under surveillance.
Indeed, emotionally it was a very tough thing to go through immediately. They've released, I think there's a 40-minute video of our farm and something like 700 photos on the internet. And the photos all focus very much on sick pigs. They show things out of context. We have 25,000 pigs on our farm and the photos will be of 20 pigs. So wherever you have 25,000 pigs, there are some sick. Our local town, Young, we have twice as many pigs as the population of Young, our local town. I think it would be a bit like going into the Young hospital, filming those people and then saying that's what the town of Young looks like. So they show it out of context, there's no explanation. Anyone who finds it on the internet will probably be shocked to see some pretty nasty pictures without an explanation of how that happened. So it was very tough. The good thing is New South Wales has now strengthened its biosecurity laws, which I'm probably the happiest person in the state about. And there's been a plus side. Pig prices didn't change. So as far as we can see, consumers haven't, stopped eating pork because of what they did to our farm. Maybe it's made us a bit tougher, brought our industry together a little bit.
Thanks for sharing that, because I think that's certainly something that would resonate with some of our visiting international journalists as well. Again, at any point, if you'd like to join in the conversation and ask any questions of the panellists tonight, please feel very welcome to do so. Now, we're running just a little bit behind schedule at the moment, so I'm going to move on now to the second phase of what we're here to do tonight. Our second technical presentation is looking at innovation in engagement, connecting researchers and producers with the community. And to do this, I'm going to let Ben McNeil off the leash. So off you go, Ben.
Now this is going to work, this pointer. Okay, I'll see how it goes. Okay, so get everyone. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about a few minutes of what we're doing to try and essentially engage R&D and research across the spectrum. So ag, medical, any technology, any research idea really. There's some massive barriers in the research ecosystem. The first one is geographic, right? So generally, when you think of, let's say, industry partnerships with researchers or research with the public, there's local fiefdoms that you have to sort of engage. You engage with people around your region, and that's fantastic, and that's really engaging, but it doesn't give you the best ideas. So really massive barriers for anyone around the world to access the best ideas. The second thing is research is hidden, generally, and pages and pages of PDF and jargon, as I said before. It's hyper specialised, and what that does is create barriers immediately. And relating to geographic issues and these huge information barriers is that there is essentially no access for other partners to come in, whether they be investors or other researchers as well. And finally, probably the most important thing is public engagement. Right now, if any of the researchers around Australia and the world are publishing, they're publishing for a specific, minute, niche audience. The public have no role to play right now in research. And so that's a really massive problem. It's a massive problem because generally most of the R&D that is spent in Australia from at least from the R&D, from the the university side is publicly funded. So it should be open up. So the researchers really need to open up and engage with the public. But how do you do that? And so I want to give you one little snapshot of what we're doing. We are essentially creating the platform for researchers to engage with little videos. Now, a video does a lot of things. It creates a very large platform for a lot of people, and you don't need a PhD to understand what a researcher is doing. So essentially, this is what we're doing. And here's one pitch from a Monash University, a researcher at Monash University. This is in medical, but this can be across the board. So I might just see if that's going to work. Is that going to work? Can you? Okay.
Someone dies of a lung disease every 3 seconds. Diseases of the lung have an enormous impact because they affect people of all ages. Premature babies struggling for their first breaths, asthmatic children, relatives and friends suffering from lung cancer, to parents and grandparents needing oxygen just to live. Often, these diseases could have been treated better or even cured if a safe and accurate means for early diagnosis were available.
My name is Andreas Foras, and in my research at Monash University, I collaborate with researchers from medicine, health, and science to engineer new technology to improve human health.
My team and I have invented a completely new form of imaging. Instead of imaging the shape of the lung, we image the lung's motion. This completely different approach is opening our eyes to see how the lungs really work. It allows the possibility of much earlier diagnosis of lung diseases when treatment is most effective, and with a fraction of the damaging radiation of a CT scan. This innovation is a real opportunity to bring a safe and accurate means for early diagnosis into hospitals where it can make the biggest difference.
Okay, so
Our technology is unlike any other technology.
probably ended up there.
Directly
This is a 3-minute pitch, but you can see what we're trying to do. So we're essentially taking research ideas, technology ideas out of the lab, right? I mean, that's a pretty basic principle, but it hasn't happened. It's not happening. So what Thinkable is a platform where organisations and researchers can actually showcase what they're doing. It's pretty simple. And what that does, because it's technology, it's internet, anyone around the world has access to that. So that means you can source the public. Let's say it's an open innovation challenge around a certain field, and that can bring in the public as well as researchers. You can have a pitch competition for startups to access amazing ideas wherever they are around the world. So that's really for commercial projects. That's the industry research link. Or you can actually, even pitch a challenge into your internal R&D. That is, if you've got a real problem you can't internally solve, you can there source collaborators from around the world to work on that problem. And so in reality, what we're trying to do is, for the first time, create a place of high quality R&D so anyone has access to it. It's very simple. And so that's us, and I'd love to be anyone who wants to come up and engage more about what we do. I'd love to have a wine with you later. So that's us.
Ben, that's
Thanks.
fantastic. Thank you. Now, Mick, you're a man who loves a bit of research. You've done a bit in your time. You've commissioned a fair bit. You champion it. What do you think of this approach?
Look, it's refreshing to hear. Whilst we've certainly got a very innovative agriculture sector here, I think it's fair to say that agriculture has fallen down the ladder a lot in terms of the focus of research, particularly in our universities. And I think part of the problem is we've created a system where universities are run as businesses, and the best and most profitable business they have is selling their education services to overseas students. And to do that, they want to go up the international rankings, and to do that, they want to publish internationally. So a paper on a fungal disease in ryegrass in grazing sheep in the Riverina just doesn't cut it when it comes to getting your points in your international publications, getting your points from the Australian Research Council to get your ERA score up. And I think that's the biggest challenge we've got, that we need to find policy settings that perhaps push this a bit further and force greater engagement between the agriculture sector and the research sector in Australia. And certainly when you travel overseas to the land grants in the US or to the major institutions in Europe, where they've got this very collaborative cluster type model of industry and researchers hand in glove and working with each other on a daily basis, that's not the model we've got here. So I'd welcome that presentation. That sounds like a good start, but I think there's some institutional policy settings there that do need to be adjusted so that we do get that integration between industry and the researchers, which is where all good innovation springs from.
So Ben, that probably begs the question about this being a new approach, a new paradigm. How's that going? Because shifting thinking is often really difficult.
That's true. That's if you're not creating problems with someone's thoughts or perceptions in a general sense, you're not innovating, right? So that's probably a good thing that most people think, you know, are sort of, well, a lot of people think that, well, this is a new approach, it sounds a bit weird. That's what innovation is. If you're not doing that, you're not breaking the ground. So, but in terms of the approach, it just makes sense. We haven't had an entrepreneurial aspect or entrepreneurial outlook in research. That's one of the problems with academia, is we have these wonderful researchers, and look, there are some who take this entrepreneurial approach of engaging industry, but I think what we're trying to do is create the real bonds between industry and researchers that can, a matchmaker, if you will, but a really ongoing matchmaker that can provide really value in R&D. Because remember, if you think of Australia is one of the worst performing countries in terms of industry engagement or uptake with researchers, so in terms of employment. And that begs the question of why, and I think one of the fundamental ones is geography as well as access, and I think the researchers have to do just as much as the industry to really come together. And I think providing a platform to do that, and an easy platform, quite cheap to do that, then it's the first step towards doing that.
What about in your real-world farming experience, Edwina? What's your perception about how research and development in the pork industry actually connects with you on the ground? And you know, is there direct connection? Is there feedback? Is there interaction?
I have to be careful. Andrew Spencer, the CEO of our RDC,
the boss
right here.
the boss is sitting in the front row, folks.
No, look, and I'm sure Andrew would say the same. There are some farmers in our industry who are very engaged and jump onto things very quickly, and there's some farmers who won't jump on in 50 years' time. So we're a very small industry, but we're very scattered geographically. So it's challenging, and it was very challenging for Australian Pork Limited to try and get the message out to us. And I know with our the carbon farming project that we have, it's been really disappointing that more pig farmers haven't taken that up. And it's, in my mind, a no-brainer because it's saved us heaps of money and it's good for the environment and it reduces odour and everything's good about it. But still people don't do it. And you know, it's hard to see why.
Marcus, we're talking obviously about the Australian perspective here, but in Europe, and maybe Switzerland in particular, do you do it better? Do you have better connection? Do you have better interaction between what's happening at the research level and with those who are ultimately the beneficiaries or the practitioners of what comes out the other end?
And if I listen to you, what you're talking about, you know, from an Australian point of view, some questions they seem quite similar to what we have, but I mean we have also a basic level of research that is mostly financed the public funds. But then when it comes up to maybe, solve challenges, actual challenges, or when it comes to develop products out of some basic research, then it goes more in private or company sponsored research. And I think it's very important that there is a good interaction between these different levels. And I think it's also, the public funding is rather getting more reduced. And it's going more to sponsorship in funding for research and development. And it's one example is that the biggest farmers cooperative, FENACO in Switzerland, it's about the largest. that they finance at the Federal Institute of Technology, which is a university that ranks among the 15 best ranked in the world, professor in plant production. But this has, on one hand, this is basic research. On the other hand, it also interacts with the federal research stations in Switzerland on one hand, and with farmers' cooperatives on the other hand. So I think this is a very good link, from what's going on the ground to what's going on at the university.
Now, we have had a few questions. Up the back first. Would you like to say who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, Dale Manson from Rural Media South Australia. Question to Ben. In terms of barriers to adoption and application of R&D outcomes, where do you see the balance between free availability and application of that for public good, industry benefit, versus the need to restrict knowledge of that or access because of licensing or royalty needs to generate funds for further research or for whoever thinks they've got ownership of it,
Yeah.
and also a competitive advantage of a market. We might do the research here, increase our productivity. Perhaps Australia wants to keep that to themselves. Where do you see the balance?
I think it depends on who's hosting or has the problem you're talking about, because they can actually have, in our system, you can have the rules in place to not disclose what you're talking about, the IP arrangements, the licensing. Because remember, a video is, what we're trying to do is take it up a level where you're not really disclosing the details of your IP, because that would be, that would cause problems in many industries and many projects, right? But by taking it up a notch to a level where you're not disclosing the sort of goodness, if you will, then you're engaging a broader perspective of stakeholders to be involved, and then to nurture that, right? So then you can take it behind closed doors, if you will. But I think from a researcher perspective, I think there really is a generational shift going on, because I think when I talk to tenured professors, they really don't like the idea of opening up in any way, shape or form. They're like, I'm well funded, I can just go to my lab and write a paper and no one reads about it and I'll be happy. Well, the younger generation, they have the best ideas, the most innovative ideas. If you look at Nobel Prizes, 80% of Nobel Prizes come from younger generation. Graham Clark's of the world, they were 30-odd when they came up with Cochlear. There's no doubting that innovation comes from a different demographic than the current one we're funding in governments, because that's the governments right now are funding the tenured professor. So we've got this massive opportunity to really engage a new demographic, and they're all more open, my point is. So they're more innovative, they're more open, they're the Facebook generation. They want to engage, they want to collaborate, they really want partners with what they're doing. And it just provides this amazing opportunity for anyone to be involved with those guys and girls. So there is I totally get what you're saying, but it is like a generational divide, but also you can disclose what you want. Just be reasonable about it. Yep.
We've had a couple of questions via Twitter. One's from @GeorgieAlley. Now, Georgie is a prolific tweeter in the rural sector here in Australia. Her question is, all good to have R&D and innovation, however, need to have uptake. What's the solution? What do you think, panel? Who wants to tackle that? Georgie?
So I think you can look at a couple of industries that have maybe done things particularly well, and I know Tim Lester mentioned cotton before in Australia, but as an industry they have collaborated incredibly closely to get to the point where 99% of the Australian cotton is grown as a GM crop. And that is now up to its third variation of Bollgard 3 that they're launching this year. And that has been really tightly managed by the industry. So they have worked with Monsanto, They have worked with government, they have worked with each other on developing the right varieties and then on managing those varieties. So they have a proper plan in place so that the effectiveness of that technology actually, I guess, extends and makes it profitable and sustainable in the future. So you get the efficiency gains and the productivity gains, but you also get something that while may have sounded expensive 20 years ago, has actually been incredible value for money along the way.
Ben, you want to jump in there?
I just wanted to jump in with regards to GM. So there's one of the problems with having research locked up behind closed doors and no one hears about it is that third parties can, from both sides of, I guess, politics and ideologies, can come in and sabotage an issue. So GM foods and GM crops. So the scientists, as you'd know, are all very supportive of this of R&D and pursuing this as a path towards feeding the planet. Whereas in the public, there is no engagement between the scientists and that are essentially saying here's the pros and cons, and most of it's pros in terms of this research. Whether it's immunisation, climate change, GMO, the scientists are not engaging. So by creating a way to which you can engage, so research engagement, it's not just about opportunities, it's also about just communicating and engaging with the public around the science, what's actually happening. So I think it's also important from that perspective that we have a much better public engagement and industry engagement with innovation generally, but innovation can be just research itself and knowledge, not just tech and investment. So I just wanted to point out that that's a really important thing from the research side too.
What about in the European context, Marcus? I mean, I guess the perception we have here on this side of the planet is that GM is a complete no-go zone for Europe. Is that still the case? Do you take anything out of what Ben was just saying?
Well, when I was listening to him, I think the first thing he said, Ben, said that the researchers they do not help build bridges to the consumers about research and what's going on. I think we have quite a lot of good examples that are doing that, especially when it comes to research also connected with GMO that I know. But I think there is a lot of polarization going on, especially in Europe. I hear also in other parts of the world. But I think from the European countries, it's different from country to country, and the European Union left it the door and open to decide also the countries. Now French is very much opposed, others are rather pro. And in Switzerland in general, the opinion is that we listen to the consumer. If the consumer is open from the point of view of the farmers would listen to the consumer, what they want, what they would accept, and they would deliver this. But because the consumer is quite hesitant about accepting GMO, despite researchers explain it or try to explain.
Because of the PR, that's essentially the communication problem, right? So if it's driven by just the consumer and they're getting fed media that's the contrary, then you're never going to have that situation where you have a R&D in GMO, no?
No, I mean it's a question of communications, and you always have interest groups that are interested in polarization, in dramatization, and they make money, or they have a profile. They get the right to be there, and this is kind of it's just another technology, and usually people are hesitant and get used to it, and I think we are in the midst of this process, but I think it's not the end of the road.
Mikio, I think this question via tweet has got your name all over it. No doubt that innovation coming from different demographic than currently being funded by government. How to change that? How do you change that? I'll give you the question again. It's a statement and a question. No doubt that innovation, and I suppose I'll insert a few words here to make it make sense, is coming from a different demographic than what's currently being funded by government. I think the suggestion is that innovation is coming from some younger minds who are not necessarily tapped into where the sources of funding can be. So how do you change that?
Well, I'll get back to a bit of a bugbear of mine, which is the reward structure that I think we've established in Australia for our biggest pool of researchers. I think the Rural Research and Development Corporations do a good job, but the structural arrangements, particularly amongst our major universities, push them towards selling the business of education and doing that via the reputation and via rewards that are based around international publications and that sort of thing, not rewards that are based around what are the needs of the community, what are the problems that we should be solving from the community. Now, it's a spectrum, if you like. It's not all black or all white. And I think, you know, for example, if we had Australian Research Council funding linked to the level of industry funding that you also had as part of that project, you suddenly start to swing the pendulum back the other way and say, oh, okay, so we have got to have a role for industry in dictating the sorts of things we need to do. And I think that would swing the pendulum back towards younger researchers that are establishing themselves rather than very well established researchers who know that they just have to churn out papers to keep getting their points. I think that's where the structural policy issue is in terms of how we run research in Australia.
I think at this point we might actually... Did you want to say something, Ben?
I'm taking a lot of time, but you're
No.
exactly right. The structures are really in place to pitch and pursue safe incremental ideas. Because safe incremental ideas can give me 5 publications a year and I'll be happy in my lab. We don't want just that. We want to pitch and hopefully invest in groundbreaking, multidisciplinary, risky ideas, because that's where the new Facebooks of ag are going to be, right? So, and if we can't have that structural change in the system, we're not really going to capture those global opportunities that Malcolm Turnbull is talking about.
Thanks, Ben. At this point, I'm keen to keep things moving because we are on a bit of a schedule here and we're trying to work towards a goal of 7 o'clock when we can actually stand up, walk around, have a chat with some of the real thinkers, movers and shakers that are in this room, especially for the benefit of our international guests, and importantly to have a drink and a bit of a feed. So at this point we'll go on to the third phase of what our discussion is about tonight, and that's looking at innovation and assurance in supply chains. And to set the scene here, I'd like to invite from Meat and Livestock Australia, MLA, Claire Cameron. Welcome, Claire.
Thanks very much. So we're going to show our video of the True Aussie brand tonight. So Australia's been exporting red meat to Asia for about 40 years. We've got a really strong presence in Asia, but it was a bit fragmented, and we really started to see a change with the way consumers thought about red meat over there. They were becoming increasingly global in their perspective on red meat. We were seeing a lot of competitors enter into the market where Australian red meat, particularly in Asia, had been for a long time. And major customers were beginning to look at foods from around the world as well. So it became very clear to us at MLA that we needed to make a change. We needed to have a common narrative. We needed to have a common reputation for our Australian beef and lamb overseas and in all our export markets. So we particularly focused on Asia because we've been very popular there with our red meat. And we noticed 3 core trends that helped to inform how we developed our brand over there. So the first was sustainability, which was about a growing awareness and consideration of environmental issues around food. The second driver was around health, so foods that made people look good and feel good. And the third was having food without fear, so products that were guaranteed to be safe from the fork to from the farm to the fork. So with this in mind, we developed the True Aussie global brand proposition, and it was built on 3 pillars that were derived from those key consumer trends that we saw. And the first was the ideal home for our livestock. So Australia, obviously, we're an island, we're quarantined from lots of disease, we've got big wide open spaces, it's a great place for our animals to grow and prosper. Peace of mind, so knowing that the product that you're eating is safe, and pure enjoyment for the customer was really important as well. So we now use our new brand positioning, our global brand positioning of True Aussie in most of the markets that we're in. So all across Asia, in Japan and Korea, we've been there for many, many years. Indonesia and Malaysia, the Philippines, Middle East, Europe, and in America now as well. So you'll see the narrative come through that we're conveying, that it's the ideal home, peace of mind, and pure enjoyment for the consumer. Do I need to press the... No.
Australian story. Our story from a special place. Early, truly unique, vast, sweeping, sun-blessed, gold and green, proud. This glorious land, it's in our blood. We share. We grow together. We take pride. True Aussie born and raised. Down to earth. Hand on heart. A cut above. Handled with care, always protected, free-spirited. Our food, your table, celebrated the world over. So come close, share. Breathe in, taste, enjoy. You're with friends.
Marcus, I might go to you first, because obviously this would be the first time you would have seen that, and I'm not meaning to put you on the spot here, and this is certainly not a trick question, but what did you take out of that? What had it been for you?
Oh, it did motivate my emotions towards what you're producing in your land, you know, and I think it's a perfect add-on to what I've experienced here when I was talking to farmers and people from the agribusiness at the agricultural shows that I've met. So I think it fits perfect. It gives me a good idea. It makes me emotional. So yeah.
Would that connect with European consumers? Would that do anything for them? Would it make them excited to run out and buy Australian produce?
I think it would motivate them. I think it would encourage them. I mean, you know, we import 50% of the sheep and lamb meat in Switzerland. We import mainly from New Zealand and Australia. 50% we produce ourselves. Maybe you can put it up if you bring, you know, if you show such promotional videos on TV. Who knows?
Now, Mick Keogh, you've been pretty public about talking about why Australia and brand Australia. I'm letting you off the leash.
Yeah, I think we probably should have been doing this a long while ago. I guess I sometimes wonder whether it's not linked to the Australian reticence to be a tall poppy or a brag or to promote yourself too loudly. I think we've sort of not really understood the merits of what we've got here, and also I think even more importantly not understood the reality of competition in the global marketplace. You know, the emergence of Brazil and the South Americans, the emergence of the Eastern Europeans in the grain sector, it's starting to become quite a competitive world, and I know there's some response here that says, well, we're developing individual brands, but I don't think they're necessarily one or the other. I think most people with individual brands would recognise that a national presence and a national profile is an important element of their offering of their individual brand. So I think we probably should have been doing it a long while ago. I think good on the MLA for getting to this stage. Whether we can broaden that out more generally across the board will be an interesting challenge. But I think the reality is that for the future of the ag sector in Australia, we do have to start to be a bit more forthright about the realities of the merits of production. I mean, we let the Kiwis get away with it. They use about 10 times as much nitrogen fertiliser as we do. They despoil their rivers. I better be careful about this.
These guys are going to New Zealand. They'll pass it on, Mick. It's okay.
And they get away with the clean green image. We've got credentials that go around New Zealand, but we just have never really come together to use them in a good, concerted manner over a long period of time. And I think we're starting to see that start to emerge, which is a good thing.
Georgia, you're with a global bank. What do you think of this kind of approach? Will it connect?
I think as long as it clearly demonstrates the value proposition for the consumers and the markets at the other end of the supply chain, the closer the supply chain can operate and communicate is incredibly important, I think, to the success of both understanding the benefit of purchasing from Australia. As Mick said, it's a very competitive marketplace, and one which we tend to lose out on a cost of production or in that landscape. So it's about, well, what is the value to you to actually spend a bit more money and get access to Australian produce? And I think there are a number of examples where it is more valuable. The food safety, the traceability is a massive element to that, and certainly one that fits in well with our key market in Asia, being China. But it's about really, beyond a logo, what does that mean, and does that resonate with the markets that we sell to?
Edwina, what about your industry? It seems not that long ago there was, the Danish product wreaking havoc in the Australian market because of the effectiveness of the Danes in producing pork and being able to ship it out right across the globe and in fine style. But it really did have impact on the Australian pork industry for a while. Do you see this approach, this sort of Team Australia, Brand Australia, this more emotional connection to the product being something that can really be an advantage for pork?
Don't forget the Americans and Canadians. They bring a fair bit of pork in here too. Look, the pig industry is a little bit different. We don't export very much. But I think that kind of advertising is fantastic. I would be interested in it being a bit domestically as well. I think that farmers get a bad rap, and we are good people, and there's great stories, and we do a fabulous job in a clean, sustainable way, and I don't think we get that story out to our own consumers either.
Ben, you're a thinker. That's what it's all about with thinking.org. This approach, what your thoughts in terms of branding things in this way and perhaps appealing to those emotions with consumers? Is there big potential?
I think from a Australian and knowing some of the amazing practices that are going on in Australia, I'm very. It's like, remember the mining ads when they started to do the mining ads. Yeah. It seems like that sort of has to happen for agriculture. There's a lot of amazing stories. One of my expertise is in carbon cycling as well, prior to doing a startup. And I remember seeing this wonderful stat around Australia leading the world in terms of carbon management. Now, not all, you were talking about before, but a lot were doing it. And they were leading the world in terms of carbon management practices related to nutrients and water. But no one knew about that. No, it wasn't really, it was going back to your issue before, no one really knows that Australian farmers in many ways are some of the most innovative and most productive environmentally in the world as well. So I think it's I think these are really important, and I just take the the example of New Zealand. Where's the Tassie community? Where's Tassie here? Is anyone? Well, they've got a great brand too. I know that they have the clean green. So maybe it's a function of just how big Australia is and our diversity. I don't know. I think it is. Right? I don't know. But I think it's really important.
Now, question from Mick Foley from The Land. How do we measure the financial benefit of branding Australian produce? What do you think, Georgia? I mean, you do a lot of analysis. You prepare lots of reports. How do you measure that?
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
That is a really difficult and equation to pull together, and I think it's something that industries have battled a lot with. The wool industry in particular has a lot of trouble. They've done a lot of generic marketing for a long time and have a very recognisable brand being Woolmark. But understanding what the value of that brand is and what that means for producer prices is a really complex equation. And you can talk about it in the sense of, well, it would cost us X amount in editorial dollars in magazines, or it would cost us X amount in events. But I think ultimately the producers are asking the question, and the industry is asking the question: is what is the market opportunity back to me? What is the return back to my investment, and how has it demonstrated and increased the opportunities that I have to sell my produce? And I think however you create that equation, it has to be a really clear and defined benefit for the producers, given that they're often funding a lot of this marketing expenditure.
So how you measure it or not, Mick Keogh, is there financial benefit to come from branding Australian produce as such?
I think there's a range of different benefits, and I'm reflecting on the fact that I was recently in the middle of the Corn Belt in the US, and there on a restaurant menu was New Zealand lamb. And it's almost generic that, quality lamb is New Zealand lamb. So obviously that brand had some impact. I think it has impacts in terms of reputation and industry pride, and there's a lot of corporate advertising that aims to achieve that, aims to unite people with a common purpose. So it may not be measurable, but you've got everyone heading in the same direction. So I think there's some of those sorts of benefits available. But I think companies grapple with this problem, and the old adage is that we know 50% of our advertising is wasted, but we don't know which 50%. And oh, by the way, we know if we stop, we're dead. They're the sort of the three truisms of advertising, so I guess yes, it is a very different thing to measure, and the Woolmark, as Georgia said, is a classic issue that no one's ever been able to get to the bottom of. But we do know in the corporate world that if you don't promote your brand, if you don't promote your image, you won't last very long. And so there is some intrinsic value. And I think too, we also see, if we look at New Zealand in terms of 100% pure, the industry is very keen to get in behind that brand and use that as the door opener for their regions and their specific product brands. So I think that's the sort of role that a national brand has. It sort of opens the door and creates an opportunity. It doesn't sell the product necessarily, but it does create those opportunities that are the beachhead, if you like, of products getting into markets.
Now Marcus, you want to chime in here?
I was just wondering, when you compare now, the image of Australian produce or lamb around the globe and New Zealand, when it comes up in my mind, I think, with New Zealand, I connect, their produce also with the tourism they do some advertising for, the landscape and the beautiful country. If I try to think about Australia, I think I don't have that much, tourism advertising and images out my mind, Ayers Rock and some cities and maybe a bush picture. So if you can link that, and we try to do that too in Europe, several areas, in the Alps, the produce and the landscape and tourism. So it creates a whole image which is very positive, which as consumer you cannot distinguish. And when you make surveys, sometimes you get some outcome out of it. And I think this could be an opportunity.
Now, I'm going to take a question over there in a minute, Dale, but before I do that, I've got one from Marty McCarthy from the ABC, and the question is the innovation that young farmers are wanting in line with the innovation being pursued by industry? Now, I'll throw this one open to the panel. I don't know who wants to start here. Mick, you're looking like you're reticent, so we might start with you.
Look, I don't know that I'm in a position to answer that. It's very hard to judge. I mean, maybe Edwina's closer to the mark in terms of understanding whether there's demands for particular problems to be solved that industry doesn't seem to respond to. I don't know.
Any thoughts, Edwina?
I don't know that I really have anything to add. I'm not sure where the first idea for our innovations came from. They're things that we've come across. So I don't know quite what demographic started them.
I've got a supplementary here for Barty. How do you get individual farmers, states and grower groups to give up individual branding and adopt Brand Australia? That's probably an easier question to answer, isn't it?
Well, I don't know why we go down to that level. I have been around each individual state, and do you know each individual state of Australia has their own brand, and you go offshore and the look of bewilderment on the recipients of that information is mind-boggling. You think someone turns up with a brand Victoria and they think it's Canada or somewhere like that. They've never heard of it. So I think we can't even get some commonality of purpose at the national level, let alone brands under that, sub-brands under that. And I think that's really the struggle at the moment.
Are we brand mad, panel? Do we have too many brands? Is that too confusing? Georgia?
I think at a trade show when you're faced with 3 or 4 different brands all representing essentially the same story but under different guises, it certainly can be. But yeah, it's really difficult too to sort of say, well, you need to fall under this banner until there's a sort of a demonstrable benefit to do that. I think just on that, the other question around the youth and whether the innovation is fitting in with their demands. I think a critical part of it is not just the research that's being provided, but we've had a lot of discussion and talk in Australia around connectivity. And mobile coverage and actually accessing research and technologies that's available for farmers now. And I think there's a real divide between rural Australia and urban Australia that certainly the government is aware of and looking at addressing, but how quickly that happens is going to affect how quickly people are able to benefit from the new technologies that are sort of being presented.
Ben?
Just to follow up on that conversation about industry and younger innovators. For any innovation, it's not just an idea. You need execution, which means you need partners, you need collaborators, whether they be other researchers and obviously commercial, industry and investment. In Australia, we're really, really bad at investing in our young ideas, period. Government doesn't invest in this space in terms of tech. I'm talking about technology and innovation. If you look at, let's say, the US or Israel, taking out GDP, it's 10 to 20 times the investment in venture capital. So that's risk capital towards technologies at the early stage, not the later stage, the early stage. It's 10 times the investment in those countries or in Europe than we see in Australia per GDP, right? So we normalise it to GDP, meaning that there's not just a lack of engagement for researchers to be utilised by industries and be skilled and go into work for them. There's also a really big hole in the venture space to take those, to essentially back those great ideas and take them to market. So most innovators, young innovators, have to go overseas, probably 90% of them, because they don't have access to that capital. Even though we have, trillion-dollar pension funds, 4th largest in the world, and a lot of capital to invest, we don't. So there's a really big cultural conversation that is most important, I think, about for us to take risk on and back our innovators. Because if we don't do that, they go offshore. And that's in ag, medical, ed tech, and across the whole space. So that's a really wider conversation to have that's really important.
Edwin, I've got a question from you via Twitter from Greg Lamp, who's one of our visiting journos from the United States. And Greg's question is, what's the pork industry doing? What does Edwina do on her farm business? And that was in connection to, there was marketing.
We don't have our own brand. I'm quite happy to leave that to someone else for the time being. We supply numerous people. We supply supermarkets, butchers, caterers through our wholesaler, but we're quite involved with the, I guess not quite the end user, but the reseller. So I haven't done my own marketing. I love the thought of the mining ad. We've actually talked about that quite a bit in our own industry, and something that just promotes farming to get the benefits out there. And maybe it's because our industry's been under attack by animal activists that we feel there's more of a push needed for some positive stories.
Now, I had a question over there. I think it was you, Dale.
Yeah, Dale Manson, Rural Media South Australia. We've had a briefing on how a lot of our R&D benefit comes from work done overseas. Saves Australia money and perhaps there's greater intellect overseas. Coupled with that, there's been a big discussion about New Zealand being perhaps our competitor or a competitor. This conference is going to New Zealand very soon. It's interesting, the Meat and Livestock Australia, Team Australia ad had a prime producer with 3 Kiwis running across his windsheeter in the middle of their ad. I'm just wondering what the benefit or otherwise may be about having a team region rather than Team Australia. Team Australia, New Zealand, we're very common and we split the cost of doing it. And we're all clean and green.
All my relatives are Kiwis, and I went over there about 3 months ago and talked about the All Blacks and the Wallabies, right? And you say to them, well, what, do you support the Wallabies when they play, let's say they play, the English or the South Africans? And they're like, no way. So there's a, I don't know if that sounds great, but just from knowing the Kiwis, I'm not sure if they're going to be really kumbaya about this, about this Australasian sort of, concept. But anyway, that's my.
It'd be a cracking rugby team, though.
It would.
We'll ask him about that in a couple of days' time and see how we go. Jürgen, you've got a question for the panel?
No, not a question, but something to tell you. Since 1905, we've had one brand of butter in Denmark, Lurpak. And we export 2/3 of what we produce. We export 90% of our pork. We have one brand, Danish. Last week, our big company producing seed in clover and grass, holding 25% of the market share, decided to drop all the small brands and go for one brand, DLF, because that's the name. You can think about it, but that's what I had to add.
Thank you very much for that. And that feeds back into what we were saying earlier about, are we brand mad? Are we confusing people because we have too many? That would suggest that the Danes are doing it really well.
And the Danes did do it very well. They had a wonderful strategy here where they introduced Lurpak into our airlines. So they recognised that travellers on airlines had higher levels of disposable income, so they provided the Lurpak butter to our major airlines at obviously very low cost, introduced the brand that way, and then introduced it via some of our major television cooking shows as a very premium product. And now it's got quite a foothold here, and even my wife buys Lurpak butter, even though I tell her that Western Star is just as good. But I think it's a classic example of a very strong marketing campaign. It's mainly brand rather than country, but it just shows what you can do with some good marketing arrangements around particular products.
I thought Western Star was better, Mick. Question to my right. Jacques, would you like to say who you are and where you're from?
I'm from Belgium, so a very small country. We only sell chocolates and beers, but but the very difficulty about regional or national brands is like the Danish. If there's someone who draw cartoons And you could have problems in all of the world because then people don't want to have Danish products. So it's also very dangerous to have such a brand because policy or other things could go through that. Yeah.
I just want to add that I agree with you. Just also from the tech side, because technology is a disruptor, and if you've got one brand and that is disrupted, it's a big risk and a big downside. You don't be, Kodak or Nokia. So that's the other downside of that.
The dilemma is we already face that risk. So our biosecurity arrangements are typically dictated at a national level, so that if there's a biosecurity breakdown, then it will affect all product from the nation. So that's one of the dilemmas we have, that we're already exposed to that sort of risk, even without a positive promotion of our brand.
So Marcus, as we get to the tail end of this afternoon's presentation, what do you sort of take out of this in terms of where you think Australia is sitting with its research and development activities, what we are achieving, and your perception of that from what you've seen?
If I try to listen to you, what you're saying here, I think I got an impression or idea that you really work hard on it and you question the system and you try to make it better, and you also are not shy to look what others are doing and putting this into the system. I mean, from the idea, what I got from the short time that I've had the chance to look at what's going on in the country, I had the idea that you're quite open. I hear also other voices that some things are not going that well when you talk with each other. I mean, that's good to listen to, but when you look from the outside, you have quite an efficient agricultural system. You produce very efficiently, export a lot. A question that I was not sure when I was looking, that you export a lot of commodities as commodity and not produce, and how the labor costs are too high. It's better to export it because labor costs in Asia and many countries are much cheaper. When we in Switzerland, we have no commodities to sell. We only have oil produce that we import and export, and we have to add a lot of innovation. Otherwise, we would not be there where we are. Not only related to agriculture, of course. So that I was wondering, if you could add more innovation to the produce, to the commodities that you sell, and have higher added value in your country, as you are, among the highest developed countries in the world. So I think I would see their opportunity for the agricultural sector.
Now, any closing questions from the group who are gathered here today? Is there anything that we haven't covered, any questions that you still might have that you'd like to pose to our panel? It is after... Yes, Gordon?
Gordon Colley is my name. I'm from Brisbane. Just from the value-adding proposition, I think you've got to look at something like the Australian wine industry, where I don't know there's how many brands are on the market, how many brands of wine are on the market, but it might be thousands, if not hundreds. Now, one bottle of wine is worth, at a minimum, in the supermarket, $5, $10 a bottle. Another bottle's worth $60 a bottle. Now, would some of the panel like to tell me that one's 5 times better value than the other one? And how does that work? Could you explain that to me?
Depends what you like, I think, Gordon.
Well, the price disparity between the brands.
So that's a fascinating example of economic psychology, right? So there's this wonderful study that was done a while ago where they took a group of people, random people, to a movie, and it was free. And they took a same movie, a separate group of people, and they took it and said, pay $20. And they rated them. Each segment rated the movie. Now, who do you think rated the movie better? The one who paid, right? So essentially, what you are buying is, so there is a very deep psychology around that, and so brands actually have to take that on board too, obviously. But it is definitely a fundamental tenet of our psychology.
Can I add to that, Gordon, I think another story of craziness is I'm an intensive pig farmer, so all our pigs are housed inside. People will pay a premium for free range. Those pigs are more likely to die, they're more likely to get squashed by their mother, they're more likely to be eaten by a fox or die of cold, yet people get a warm and fuzzy feeling when they pay 3 times as much to buy it.
Good point. Any other questions? It is 7:10 and I said that we were trying to work to 7 o'clock to wind things up this evening. And if there aren't, I'm going to do that right now, because if there's one thing I know, it's not to stand between a thirsty journalist and a beer, or a hungry journalist and a good feed. So tonight has been, I think, really special for the delegates who have come here from different countries as they travel towards New Zealand tomorrow, to really get some insights into what happens with rural research and development activities in Australia. And certainly on behalf of them and the Australian Council of Agricultural Journalists, who have been instrumental in pulling all of this together, we really owe a great deal of thanks to the very generous sponsorship of the RDCs and the great information that you have been part of providing this afternoon and into this evening here for our international delegates. So, to give a few particular thank yous, I'd like to really make special mention of the RDC reps, the Council of Rural and Rural and Development Corporations. Tim Lester, the Operations Manager, who you have heard from this afternoon. Tim, that was a fantastic briefing, and thank you very much for painting the picture that you did, and for being so instrumental in making this function happen this evening, and for overall for the RDCs for your sponsorship of the event. Also, some of the CEOs from some of the RDCs are with us tonight, and I'd certainly encourage our international friends to make sure that you do take the chance to have a chat with some of these guys and to pick their brains about what's going on in their particular area. We have Andrew Spencer from Australian Pork Limited, who is here in the front row, Bruce Finney from the Cotton R&D Corporation, Craig Burns from Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation, and Selwyn Snell, who's the chair of the Council of RDCs and chair of Horticulture Innovation Australia. And of course, from these organisations as well, some people who have been absolutely worth their weight in gold in recent days, and certainly today. They are Ruth Redfern, who's the Comms Manager for Cotton, Emily McIntosh, General Manager of Comms with Australian Pork Limited, and Claire Cameron, GM of Communications with Meat and Livestock Australia. Could you please give them all our very warm vote of thanks? And I think you'd agree that this evening's setting here on Circular Quay in Sydney is a fantastic way to end what's been a really fascinating 4 days in Australia for our delegates. Again, to all of our sponsors, but particularly the Rural Development Corporations, thank you so much for seeing the benefit in providing some of this information, giving these insights to our international visitors, and for your generosity. So, give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you for your participation. And that's where we'll cease the formal part of proceedings tonight. Please get yourself a drink and enjoy the feed. Thank you. Enjoy.